Out with the old and also the other old. It's Segaiden episode 72.
今は一人でも多くの味方が欲しいところ。
やでー!
Here at the end of 1988, another miracle has occurred on Sega Master System. This time, I do mean Miracle Warriors, but I also have to ask, what the hell were they thinking with this game? I've had a little trouble finding online consensus for the release date of Miracle Warriors, which is why this overview has ended up pulling mop-up duty here at the end of 1988. Some sources say October 1988, while others give a November date. Whatever the case, one fact remains incontrovertible. Miracle Warriors shipped to American stores around the same time as Phantasy Star. This raises the question of why? Why on earth would Sega do such a thing? Miracle Warriors is a pretty rough take on the role-playing genre by any measure, but to force it to sit side by side with the single coolest and most enticing RPG of the 1980s, a game that stands up to all-timers like Dragon Quest III and IV on consoles as the peak of 8-bit role-playing, that's just cruel. I mean, not every game can be Phantasy Star. In fact, literally, no other game ever made was. But this really feels less like a canny business choice to capitalize on the Master System's lead in the RPG space, more like someone on the Miracle Warriors team had a humiliation kink. Miracle Warriors feels like an out-of-date computer RPG, hide-glide with a party system and turn-based combat. And that's because Miracle Warriors is in fact an out-of-date computer RPG. Originally debuting on the Japanese PC-88 home computer, Miracle Warriors, aka Haja no Fuin in Japan, made its way to every conceivable Japanese home computer of the era before Sega picked it up and reprogrammed it for Master System. Their Mark III release arrived a couple of months before Phantasy Star and shipped in a deluxe package containing a fold-out map and a tiny figurine of the main character, in case you weren't sure that this game is a D&D tabletop miniatures as hell. And to reinforce the grown-up, which is to say kind of awkward and boring nature of the game, the Japanese box also placed a completely naked demoness front and center on the artwork, with her bare ladies not only on prominent display but actually serving as the focal point of the illustration. The US art unsurprisingly redrew this lady with modest body armor as part of the process of recreating the original painting into something more worthy of being airbrushed on the side of a van that smells permanently of bong water. The glorified tabletop campaign vibe defines the overall aesthetic of Miracle Warriors. I mean, dig that groovy title screen, which looks like an ELP or Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young album cover. It's the most 70s basement Warriors thing you could imagine. Before Sega reprogrammed this game for their own nefarious ends, Miracle Warriors was the creation of Kogado Studio, whose history reads like the answer to the thought exercise, what if Nintendo had never made Donkey Kong? Kogado has been around for more than a century, and they still make tons of video games. They're probably best known these days for the Nurse Love series. Kogado began as a toy and publishing company before beginning to make video games, and these days everything produced by Kogado falls into the niche PC adventure category. Clearly though, the company made its initial video games transition by creating clunky role-playing games like Miracle Warriors. This journey is hardly unique to Kogado. Sega didn't radically invent Miracle Warriors when they brought it to Master System. It retains the same overall flow and screen layout as the computer releases, making use of a cramped interface that shoves everything into tiny windows. I do see a lot of visual similarities between Miracle Warriors for Master System and Sega's own conversion of the Black Onyx for SG-1000, especially in the specific design of the hide-glide-esque health and experience bars. A super cool thing about 80s Sega is that they didn't bother to credit their developers for their work, so it's impossible for me to say this with any certainty, but I feel fairly comfortable speculating that the Black Onyx conversion team just rolled right on into this project after shipping that one. It arrived in Japan about 8 months after the Black Onyx. That's just about the correct amount of time for a small team to adapt an 8-bit title like this. The defining feature of Miracle Warriors and all of its incarnations is that its visual balance overemphasizes a not great illustration of your party's progress while relegating the actual progression, that is, the navigation of the world, to barely more than a thumbnail on the screen. The world map here consists of the same tiled icons as something like its contemporary Dragon Quest, except that instead of switching over to a full-screen world map as you travel, the game just crams the map into a tiny 5x5 window. Sega compensated for this extremely limited view by packing in a fold-out world map with a game in all regions, which helps. At the tiny windowed view definitely makes orienteering tough, even without resources. Then again, tough appears to be the operative word here. Keeping with its PC origins, Miracle Warriors opens your journey by pitting you against almost impossible odds. You begin the adventure with no weapons, items, money, clothes, or companions, besides a useless fairy who flits alongside you doing nothing of value. You are a naked man wandering alone with his fairy companion in the wilderness. You need to fight monsters through turn-based battles, soaking up more damage in the process than you can afford to heal at the nearby town. There's no free healing here, and not all enemies drop cash, so the premise is that you need to fight specific foes who yield tons of money so that you can keep your health topped up while saving your guilders for gear. Bear in mind that all encounters are random, and if you stray even a dozen tiles away from the starting point in the wrong direction, you will encounter monsters that can slaughter your naked ass in a single hit. It's good times for folks who love to grind, less so for the rest of our species. But as with so many games like this, it does become more manageable as you advance. Recruiting allies to form a 4-person party and decking out everyone with quality combat gear increases your survivability. And, in the future tradition of the future Metroidvania genre, the stronger you become, the more ambitiously you can venture out into the world. Miracle Warriors does offer the satisfaction of empowerment and exploration, which we all love. But this is a tough game to go back to in 2025, and I have to imagine that anyone who experienced Phantasy Star and Golvelius around this time would have found Miracle Warriors a little off-putting too. Still, I respect Sega's determination to represent the role-playing genre in its fullness on Master System. At a time when RPGs on US consoles meant sometimes you see numbers fly up while you're jumping around like Super Mario, Miracle Warriors offers us a glimpse of the uncut JRPG in its purest, most hateful form. It's not a bad game at all, but I have to say it makes for a far more demanding and unforgiving introduction to the genre than something like Phantasy Star or Dragon Warrior, or even Ultima Exodus, which would arrive a few months later on NES. I mean, this game even has a Final Fantasy Legend-style weapon degradation system that actually extends to your armor and your shield, too. That's a lot to ask of a newcomer to the genre. Still, I could see myself getting into Miracle Warriors back in the day if I'd been able to figure out the ideal play loop of hunting for early game enemies that yield a crap ton of cash like evil merchants and great lions, hanging out close to towns to heal and repair gear, and grinding for levels for an hour or two before venturing on to the next plot point. But no, while Nintendo kids like me were microdosing with Zelda 2, Sega fans were freebasing the pure, uncut formulation. No wonder they all turned out to be a little quirky. Miracle Warriors received a full-page preview way back in issue 3 of the Sega newsletter. I note that the person putting together this preview also didn't bother to grind far enough to start collecting party members, so I don't feel quite so bad about not bothering to grab footage beyond the first 90 minutes of play or so myself. So that's it for the Master System's American run for 1988. As it happens, the very first release for this console in 1989, Activision's Bomber Raid, would also be the very final release for the Japanese Mark III. And that means we should do a little mop-up now to check out the last of the Japanese exclusive releases for this platform. Let's start in March 1988 with the shocking arrival of not one but 2 third-party titles on Mark III. These 2 releases stand out for a few reasons, not least of all being that they ended up as the only 2 third-party releases for the console in Japan. Both were based on Tecmo arcade properties, and both came not from Tecmo, but instead from a company called Salio. We've encountered Salio before, out of chronological order, over on Game Boy Works as the developers of Fish Dude. Here, though, they don't appear to have worked in any sort of development capacity, but rather as publishers. Well, maybe. The GDRI has one of the games pegged as being from iSystem Tokyo, based on that company's fossil of a website, while this episode's game, Argos no Juujiken, appears to have been developed by Tecmo and published by Salio, based on the fact that Tecmo's in-house composer Mikio Saito has a hidden credit in the game. If that's the case, I don't honestly know why Tecmo didn't simply publish these games themselves on Mark III, and why Salio, a company that has no publishing credit on its CV before this point, handled the honors. All I can speculate is that this had something to do with Nintendo's hammerlock on publishers at the time via exclusivity contracts, but I don't think that's really the case. By the time Argos no Juujiken shipped, Namco was publishing on both Famicom and PC Engine, And anyway, from what I understand, Nintendo didn't require total exclusivity from publishers, just exclusive versions of their games, which they got with the Famicom counterpart of this one, but maybe Tecmo just didn't want to rock the boat. Or maybe they didn't feel like navigating the waters of setting up a publishing arrangement on a console that had little traction and wouldn't even be an active concern within a year, so they outsourced it. Who knows? In any case, the Tecmo and Salio connection does at least make sense. According, again, to the GDRI, these two companies shared office space in the same building. So this was probably one of those deals made casually between executive-level pals after too much sake one night at the izakaya, the Japanese business equivalent of the 3-martini power lunch.
And don't let me see the bottom of this glass.
Whatever the case, it resulted in this, another unique home release of Rygar. I say another because of course the NES version from a year before this was not just unique, but wildly unique. The arcade game took the form of an almost entirely linear game, where a beefy guy in a tiara runs left to right and hits things with a very large disc, pausing occasionally to climb up or down a rope. The NES game retained some vague trappings of the coin-op, but expanded the design to span a huge, non-linear world where players had to navigate top-down hubs and could backtrack between zones while collecting permanent inventory upgrades and earning experience points with which to become even beefier. The Mark III release hews a lot closer to the arcade game, lacking progressive power-ups which reset upon death, and sticking to the run left to right dynamic. It even keeps the strange, springy rope ladders from the coin-op. However, it simultaneously streamlines the arcade game's design, reducing more than 20 largely repetitive stages down to half a dozen, while also adding just the tiniest little hint of non-linearity. This is no Metroidvania, mind you, because ultimately you are just going left or right, and occasionally down or up. But sometimes you have to double back slightly to take an alternate path through the stage because the main route over ground is obstructed. It's not much, but it's more than the arcade game gave you. Funnily enough, this double back aspect does come from the coin-op game, in a way. Many stages in the original Rygar featured a sort of cut-away diagram element, where you could see monsters roaming underground before they'd pop up through the soil to attack you. Argos no Juujiken forces you to drop down into these spaces from time to time and battle the little rolling guys head-on. It's a very interesting creative choice that reinforces the notion that Tecmo did develop this version internally, trying to fine-tune the design of Rygar on the fly. They'd gone boringly linear in arcades, bafflingly open on Famicom. Now here's a linear, but less boring game that breaks up the left to right movement in small ways. It's not much, but it's honest work. Honestly, I'd call this cartridge the best take on the pure action iteration of Rygar. The arcade original feels incredibly drawn out and gets boring fast, as do other faithful takes like the Lynx adaptation. This streamlined interpretation feels more focused. You have a half dozen stages to master, which consist of short segments that resemble the arcade game's locations, but don't repeat almost endlessly. Each stage culminates in a boss battle, and reaching the boss of a given level demands incredible skill and a slight ability to predict the future, since the game does love to hit you with cheap attacks out of nowhere. The hero can collect icons that give him greater powers, like the ability to swing his disc armor overhead in a wide circle that clears the air, and holding onto these power-ups proves essential to progression and survival. For those who wanted to play Rygar in the 8-bit era and found the radical, cutting-edge for the time open-world action design of the NES game disappointing, Argos no Juujiken offers a great alternative. It's one of the better arcade adaptations on a platform packed with them, which makes it all the greater a shame that it never left Japan. Thanks for nothing, Salio. Next time on Segaiden, Mark III? More like Marked III, marked for death.